cold wind moved through the narrow streets of the old spaceport, carrying the smell of oil, smoke, and garbage. Shadows stretched long under the weak yellow lights, and most people hurried with their heads down. Trying to reach somewhere warm, Mark was one of them, hands in his jacket pockets. Walking home after a long shift at the repair shop, his boots splashed in dirty puddles, his mind already thinking about the hot cup of tea waiting in his small apartment. But then he saw something that made him stop. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog hunched over a metal bowl near the wall. The dog was thin, its ribs showing, licking the last drops of cold stew from the rusty dish. But next to it, crouched low on the ground, was a figure wrapped in torn cloth. The figure's long fingers were scooping food from the same bowl, eating quickly like someone who had not tasted anything for days. Mark froze, his heart sinking. The shape under the rags was not human. The skin that showed from under the cloth was pale with a faint blue tint. The fingers tipped with small claws. He realized it was a woman, an alien woman thin to the bone. Her hair messy and tangled, her shoulders shaking from cold and hunger. Around them, people passed without looking. Some glanced for a moment, then turned away. One man even smirked, shaking his head like it was nothing unusual. Mark felt anger rise inside him. How could anyone see this and just keep walking? He took a step closer, but the dog growled low, guarding the bowl. The alien woman didn't even flinch at the sound. Her eyes stayed on the scraps in front of her, scooping more into her mouth as if afraid it would be taken away. The food was spoiled, the smell of rot mixed with the sour stink of old meat. Mark almost gagged, wondering how she could eat it. But then he realized, when you are starving, you don't care. Mark spoke softly. "Hey, are you all right?" The woman froze mid-bite, her head lifting slowly to large eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, looked at him with suspicion and fear. Her lips trembled as she spoke in broken, Galactic common? No. Hurt. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Mark shook his head, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you," he said gently, but she still clutched the bowl, her body tensed like a cornered animal, up close. He could see her face beautiful once, maybe, but now marked by dirt, bruises, and exhaustion. A faint scar crossed her cheek, and around her neck was a red mark, as if something had been tightly chained there for a long time. From his bag, Mark pulled out a small wrapped sandwich he had saved for later. He knelt and held it out to her. The smell of fresh bread reached her, and he saw her nostrils flare. Her eyes darted from the food to his face, unsure. It was clear she didn't trust him. Maybe she had learned that kindness always came with a price. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then her trembling hands reached out. Taking the sandwich like it might vanish, she bit into it, her eyes closing for a second, as if tasting something warm for the first time in years. Mark felt a strange ache in his chest. No. One should have to live like this. But before he could speak again, loud voices echoed from the far end of the street. The alien woman's eyes widened in panic. She looked over her shoulder, then back at Mark, fear shaking her whole body. Mark glanced toward the sound and saw 3 dark shapes moving quickly through the crowd. They weren't just random passersby. Something in their movement told him they were looking for someone. The woman stuffed the last bite into her mouth and tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, her hand gripping the wall for support. Mark's instincts screamed at him whoever those men were. They were trouble, and they were getting closer. In that moment, Mark knew he had 2 choices. He could keep walking, pretend he saw nothing, and stay out of danger, or he could step into whatever nightmare this woman was running from. The dog growled again, the wind howled between the buildings, and the voices came nearer. Mark made his choice. He reached out his hand and said firmly, "Come with me." The alien woman hesitated, looking at his hand, then at the shadows coming closer. Finally, she took it, her cold fingers gripping his tightly, and together they turned and disappeared into the dark alleys of the spaceport. The chase had just begun. The alley was narrow and dark, the walls wet from leaking pipes. Mark pulled the alien woman behind him, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. Her steps were uneven, and more than once she stumbled. But she didn't let go of his hand. Behind them, the sound of voices faded for a moment. Replaced by the echo of dripping water, Mark stopped. Near a side door, checking if anyone was following, the woman pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard, clutching the sandwich wrapper like it was the most valuable thing she owned. Her eyes darted in every direction, her body still tense. Mark raised a finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet after a few seconds of silence. He asked softly, "Are you hurt?" The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her words were slow and broken. "No." "Hurt." Now, her voice was so soft it almost got lost in the sound of the leaking pipe. Mark could see the bruises on her arms more clearly now under the dim light. The skin there was mottled purple and green, some marks fresh, others old. Around her wrists were thin scars, like she had been tied for long periods. The sight made his jaw tighten. He wanted to ask who those men were, but he could see she wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he said, "I have a place. Warm food," pointing toward the direction of his apartment. She shook her head quickly, backing away a little. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, as if she was waiting for him to reveal his real intentions. Mark understood people like her. Didn't trust anyone if she had been treated like an animal. Every offer of kindness must have come with a hidden cost. Still, he wasn't going to leave her here. "You can leave after," he said slowly. "Just rest." "And eat?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking once more toward the street they had come from. Then she gave a tiny nod, the kind of nod that said she was only agreeing because she had no other choice. Mark took the lead again, moving quickly. But carefully, he kept an ear out for footsteps. But the spaceport streets seemed quieter now. They reached a back entrance to his building. It was an old repair shop on the lower floor with his small living space above. The metal stairs groaned under their weight as they climbed. When they reached the door, Mark unlocked it and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The woman paused at the threshold. Her eyes swept across the small room, an old couch, table with tools scattered on it, a heater in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it smelled faintly of engine oil and tea. She stepped inside. Slowly, her bare feet silent on the worn floor. Mark closed the door and locked it. He noticed how she flinched slightly at the sound of the lock turning. He pretended not to see and moved toward the small kitchenette. "Sit," he said, pointing to the couch. She obeyed, but her posture stayed tight, like she was ready to run at any moment. Mark poured water into a pot and placed it on the small stove. He could feel her watching his every movement. When the water began to heat, he pulled out a packet of instant soup and poured it in. The smell of broth filled the room, and he saw her eyes follow the steam while it cooked. Mark sat across from her. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman looked away as if the question was too personal. After a long pause, she whispered, "Rin." The name was short, but there was weight in it, like it carried pieces of a past she didn't want to remember. "Rin?" Mark repeated softly. "My name's Mark." She gave no reply, just kept her eyes fixed on the pot of soup. When it was ready, he poured it into a bowl and handed it to her. The moment the warm ceramic touched her hands, her fingers tightened around it. She bent forward, breathing in the steam before taking a small sip. Mark noticed how careful she was. She ate slowly at first, as if afraid the food might be taken away mid-bite. Then hunger broke through her caution, and she began eating faster. Some of the broth dripped down her chin, but she didn't stop. Mark quietly placed a piece of bread on the table near her, and she grabbed it without a word. When the bowl was empty, she set it down. But her eyes stayed lowered. Mark leaned back in his chair, trying to keep his tone gentle. "Those men, they were looking for you." Her shoulders stiffened. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered, "Yes. Bad men." The way she said it made his stomach knot. There was no doubt she meant dangerous. "Why?" he asked quietly. Rin shook her head, her hair falling over her face. "No talk." "Not now," she murmured. Mark didn't push. Instead, he said, "You're safe here." For tonight, her gaze lifted, meeting his for the first time without fear. But in that look, Mark saw something else worry. It's as if she knew safety never lasted. Outside, the wind howled through the streets, somewhere in the distance. Heavy boots stepped on wet stone. Mark glanced at the locked door and made a silent promise. If those men came here, they wouldn't take her without going through him. The night outside was quiet for only a few minutes. Mark sat at the table, his mind still on the way Rin had clutched the soup bowl like it was her last link to life. She sat, curled on the couch, her knees pulled close, eyes half closed, but never fully relaxed. It was the look of someone who had lived too long in fear. Then, a sound broke the silence. Heavy footsteps. They were slow at first, then sharper. The kind of steps made by people who weren't just passing by, they were searching. Mark's body tensed. Rin's head shot up, her hands gripping the couch cushions. Her breathing quickened. Mark moved to the window and pulled the curtain slightly. 3 figures were in the street below, the same dark shapes he had seen earlier. Their heads turned slowly from side to side, scanning doorways and alleys. One of them spoke in a low, rough voice. The words foreign, but the tone clear impatience mixed with anger. "They found us," Rin whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted to the locked door like she expected it to burst open any second. Mark turned to her. "We need to go. Now?" She hesitated, fear freezing her for a moment. Then she nodded quickly. Mark grabbed his jacket and a small bag from under the table. He stuffed in a flashlight, a water bottle, and a few tools, things that might help if they had to move fast. "Stay close," he said. Opening the back door, the cold air rushed in. Carrying the smell of rain and metal, they slipped into the narrow back alley, the darkness swallowing them. The ground was wet, and Rin's bare feet made no sound, but Mark's boots splashed. And every step felt louder than it should. He kept looking over his shoulder, but for a moment, it seemed they had a head start. Then came the voices, closer now. The men were moving around the building, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Mark's heart pounded in his ears. He led Rin through a maze of alleys, turning sharply at each corner, hoping to lose them. But the spaceport was a place he knew too well. It was easy to get trapped in dead ends. They turned into one such corner. The walls on both sides too high to climb. Rin's eyes widened in panic before she could speak. Mark spotted an old maintenance door on the left. He tried the handle locked, cursing under his breath. He pulled a small tool from his bag and forced the lock. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside. Closing it quietly behind them, the air inside was stale, filled with the smell of rust and damp. They were in a narrow service tunnel, the walls lined with pipes that dripped slowly into puddles on the floor. The sound of their pursuers grew faint, then loud again, as if they were circling. Rin touched Mark's arm, pointing toward a faint light far down the tunnel. They moved toward it, careful not to splash too much halfway through. The echo of boots hitting metal grates filled the tunnel behind them. "They're in here," a voice shouted, this time in a language Mark understood. Mark didn't look back, he just grabbed Rin's hand and ran. The tunnel twisted sharply, leading them to a grated door. It was half broken. Hanging on one hinge, Mark kicked it open and they stumbled out into another alley. This one leading toward the busy part of the port. Crowds were their best chance if they could blend in. They might disappear before the thugs spotted them again. They pushed into the market street, the noise of vendors and machinery masking their movements. Rin pulled the hood of her torn cloth over her head, keeping her face down. Mark kept one hand on her shoulder, guiding her through the press of bodies, but even in the crowd, danger followed. One of the men spotted them, shouting to the others. The crowd thinned as they reached the far side of the market, and suddenly they were in open space again. Mark cursed. Now there was nothing between them and the men. Run! He shouted. They dashed down the main loading lane. Weaving between crates and cargo haulers, Rin was fast despite her weakness, her survival instinct pushing her forward. Behind them, heavy footsteps grew closer. A metal pipe clattered to the ground as one thug knocked over a stack of scrap. Mark grabbed Rin's arm and pulled her toward a stack of shipping containers. They squeezed into the narrow gap between them. Pressing against the cold steel, the men ran past, their footsteps fading for a moment. Rin's breathing was ragged, her eyes wide with terror. Mark put a finger to his lips again. They waited in the shadows until the sound of boots was far enough away. Then he whispered, "We can't go back to my place. They'll search it." Rin nodded, her face pale. Her voice was barely audible. "They won't stop." Mark knew she was right. He didn't know who they were or why they wanted her, but he understood one thing: they would keep coming until they had her. Which meant the only choice now was to stay ahead of them. And that meant leaving the spaceport entirely. He glanced toward the far end of the lane, where the faint lights of the docking bays flickered in the mist. A plan began forming in his mind. Risky, but maybe their only chance. He looked at Rin, her thin frame trembling in the cold. "We're getting out of here," he said. And before she could ask where, he led her toward the docks. Somewhere behind them, the voices rose again. The chase wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The docking bay lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cold steel floor. Mark and Rin moved quickly, keeping to the edges, staying hidden behind stacks of cargo crates. The noise of loading crews, rumbling engines, and shouting foremen masked their footsteps, but Mark's ears stayed sharp. Listening for the sound of those same boots that had been chasing them all night, he led Rin toward a side exit at the far end of the bay. Beyond it, there was a service lift that connected directly to an upper street, a place far from the thugs' usual hunting ground. If they could reach it, they might be able to disappear into the city, at least for a little while. They reached the lift without being seen. Mark hit the button, and the doors creaked open with a tired groan. Inside, the small cabin smelled faintly of grease and stale air. Rin stepped in without a word, her hood still drawn low over her face. The doors slid shut, and for the first time since they started running, Mark let out a long breath when the lift stopped. They stepped into a quiet street lit by a single dim lamp. It was far from the busy port. This was a residential area. Mark knew a small shop nearby run by an old friend who wouldn't ask too many questions. More importantly, above the shop was a single spare room with a working heater. They slipped through the side entrance, climbing narrow stairs to a door that groaned when Mark pushed it open. The room was small: a bed, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a heater in the corner humming softly. It wasn't much, but compared to the cold streets, it felt like a safe haven. Mark closed and locked the door, then looked at Rin. "You can rest here for now," he said. She didn't move toward the bed. Instead, she stood near the door, her back against the wall, eyes darting from corner to corner like she was still expecting danger. Mark understood. Trust wouldn't come instantly. He walked over to the table, setting down his small bag. "I'll make something to eat," he said, his voice calm but firm. The shop below sold basic supplies, and Mark had a key to the pantry. Within minutes, he brought up bread, dried meat, and a packet of soup mix. He boiled water in a dented pot on the small stove, and the smell of broth soon filled the air. Rin's gaze stayed fixed on the pot, her nostrils flaring slightly at the scent. She sat at the table only when Mark placed a bowl in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the spoon. The first sip seemed to melt something inside her shoulders, lowered slightly, and her eyes softened. Mark stayed quiet, letting her eat without questions. She finished half the soup before finally speaking, her voice quiet but clearer than before. "Why help me?" she asked. Mark met her gaze, because no one else would. He said simply. Her eyes flickered, as if she wasn't used to such a plain answer. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more, but instead, she looked back at the bowl. When she spoke again, it was even softer. "Rin. My name is Rin." Mark repeated it slowly, letting the name settle between them. "Rin," he said. "I'm Mark." There was a small pause, and then, almost like she was testing the sound, she said, "Mark." It was the first time he had seen her lips curve into the smallest hint of a smile. "Encouraged?" he asked gently. "Those men? Who are they?" Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. She set the spoon down, staring into the soup as if the answer was written there. "Bad men?" "From slave ship," she whispered. The words made Mark's jaw tighten. "They take many. Sell," she continued, her voice breaking. "I escape. But they want me back." Mark clenched his fists under the table. In his mind, he could see it her being dragged through crowded docks, chained, sold to the highest bidder, treated like property. "How long have you been running?" he asked. Rin's eyes glistened. "Since. Many days. No food. No sleep." Her voice dropped even lower. "If they take me, I die." Mark leaned forward, his tone steady. "They won't take you." She looked at him, searching his face as if to see whether he meant it. Something in his eyes must have convinced her, because she nodded once, almost reluctantly. But Mark knew that words weren't enough. He would have to prove it with action. The rest of the meal passed in silence. When she finished, she leaned back in the chair, looking both exhausted and relieved. Mark pushed the bed toward her. "But—" she shook her head. "You? Sleep," she said. He chuckled softly. "You need it more than I do." Finally, she climbed onto the bed, lying on top of the blanket instead of under it. Her eyes stayed half open, scanning the room even as sleep began to pull her under. Mark sat by the window, watching the street below. The night was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't last. Somewhere in the city, the men who had been chasing them were still searching, and when they found a lead, they would come. Mark's mind was already working through their next move. For now, though, the priority was simple: let Rin rest. Give her strength, because the next time they ran, it would be even harder to escape. The first light of morning crept through the narrow window. Mark was still sitting in the chair by the window, his eyes heavy but unwilling to close completely. Rin was on the bed, curled up, her breathing slow and steady. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost peaceful. He didn't want to wake her, but soon the sounds of the street below grew louder: shop doors opening, carts rolling, vendors calling out. The city was alive again, and with it came the risk of being found. Mark knew they couldn't stay in this room for long. When Rin's eyes finally opened, she sat up quickly, scanning the room as if making sure nothing had changed during the night. Her gaze landed on the door, then on Mark. "You stay awake all night?" she asked softly. Mark shrugged. Didn't feel like sleeping. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, almost as if she was trying to figure out why he cared. Mark poured some hot water into a cup, dropping in a tea bag. He slid it across the table toward her. "Drink this," he said. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the steam rise to her face. For a moment, she just held it. Like the warmth itself was something rare. "You don't have to tell me everything." Mark began slowly. "But I need to know enough to keep you safe." Her eyes lowered, and she didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice was low and uneven. From small village, far away," she said. "We live simple. No trouble." Her hands tightened around the cup. "But raiders come. Take many. Burn homes." Mark could almost see it in his mind, the smoke rising over the hills. The screaming, the chaos. "They kill some. Sell some," she continued, her eyes distant. "Healer. In my people. But no one come for me." The last words carried a pain that Mark could feel in his chest. "No one?" he asked. Gently, she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They say I tainted. Not worth bring back." Mark's jaw clenched, anger flashing in his eyes. It was one thing to be taken, it was another to know your own people had left you to rot. "They sell me to man. Rich but cruel," she went on, her voice shaking. "Make me clean floors. Carry heavy things. No food, if slow. Hit if speak." She touched the faint scar on her cheek, then the red mark around her neck. "He put chain. Say I am less than his dog." Mark's stomach twisted. He had seen cruelty in the galaxy before, but hearing it like this, from someone sitting across from him, made it burn differently. "How did you get away?" he asked. Rin took a slow breath. "Night storm come. Ship dock in port. Guard drunk. I run." She glanced toward the window, as if expecting to see someone standing there, but he send men. "They chase me if they take me back." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I die slow." Mark leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "They won't take you back," he said firmly. Rin looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You say that. But you not know them," she murmured. "Then tell me." Mark replied. "Tell me everything about them, so I can keep you away from them." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not now. If I speak too much, I feel like they hear." Mark wanted to push, but he could see how tightly she was holding herself together. Forcing her now would only make her retreat further. Instead, he changed the subject. "We need to leave this place soon." Her shoulders tensed. "Where?" "Somewhere they won't think to look," Mark said. "The longer we stay here, the more chance they find us." Rin nodded slowly, but he could see the fear behind her eyes. A sudden noise outside made them both freeze. A loud knock on the shop's main door below. Voices followed, muffled but sharp. Mark moved quickly to the window, leaning just enough to see. Two men stood there, one of them he recognized from the night before. They were talking to the shop owner, showing him something, maybe a picture. Mark's pulse quickened. "They're here," he whispered to Rin. Her face went pale, and she moved closer to the wall. Mark grabbed the bag he had prepared the night before. "We're leaving now," he said. He opened the door to the hallway, guiding her toward the back stairs. They moved fast but quiet. Down below, the voices grew louder, and the sound of boots on the shop floor told him they were coming inside. By the time the thugs reached the upper landing, Mark and Rin were already slipping out the back door into the alley. The cold morning air hit their faces as they ran. Rin clutched the strap of the bag, her breath coming in quick bursts. They weaved through narrow streets, past delivery carts and closed stalls. Mark didn't stop until they reached the edge of the district. Only then did he allow them to slow down. Rin bent over, her hands on her knees, gasping for air. Mark glanced back, no sign of the men yet. "But that didn't mean they were safe. They're getting closer each time," he said. Rin nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "They always do." Mark knew then that this wasn't just a chase, it was a hunt, and if they didn't change the game soon, they would lose. Asterisk, the cold air burned in Mark's lungs as they moved deeper into the city's old quarter. Rin stayed close behind him, her head down, her steps light. The narrow streets were quieter here, but the silence felt dangerous, like the city itself was holding its breath. Mark knew they couldn't run forever sooner or later. The men chasing them would catch up. They turned into a dead-end courtyard without realizing it. Tall walls rose on all sides. The only way out was the way they came in. Mark cursed under his breath, about to turn back, when he heard its footsteps, steady and closing in from the UHE. From the shadows of the alley they had just entered, 3 men emerged, blocking their exit. Mark recognized them instantly, 2 of them from the docks last night. The third, a broad-shouldered alien with a scar running from his jaw to his ear. The scarred man grinned, showing sharp teeth. "Running makes it worse," he growled. His voice heavy with menace. Rin froze, her hands trembling at her sides. Mark stepped in front of her, his stance wide. "You're not taking her," Mark said firmly. The man with the scar tilted his head, amused. "You think you can stop us, human? She belongs to someone, and that someone doesn't like losing property." Mark's grip tightened on the wrench he'd taken from his bag earlier. "She's not property," he shot back. The 3 men began to spread out, cutting off any chance of escape. Mark could feel Rin's breath quickening behind him. He leaned back slightly, whispering, "When I move, run if you get the chance." She shook her head violently, whispering back, "No. Not leave you." There was no more time to argue. One of the thugs lunged forward. Swinging a metal pipe, Mark ducked, the pipe whistling past his head. He countered with a swing of his wrench. Catching the thug in the ribs, the man staggered back, swearing. The second attacker came in from the side, aiming a punch at Mark's jaw. Mark blocked with his forearm, feeling the impact rattle through his bones. Before he could counter, the scarred man moved in. Fast and dangerous, he swung a heavy fist, catching Mark in the shoulder, sending him stumbling. Rin's eyes darted between the fight and the alley, but she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed a length of broken pipe from the ground. Stepping forward, when one of the men tried to grab her, she swung hard, hitting his arm with a sharp clang. The man roared in pain. Backing off for a moment, Mark recovered his footing, using the distraction to land a solid blow to the scarred man's knee. The alien growled, staggering, but not falling. He swung again, faster this time, but Mark sidestepped, using his smaller frame to stay out of reach. It was a brutal, messy fight, no skill, just survival. The first thug charged again, but Rin moved quicker than he expected. She jabbed the pipe toward his stomach, forcing him to double over. Mark didn't waste the moment. He slammed the wrench across the back of the thug's head, dropping him to the ground, but the scarred man was still standing. Fury in his eyes. "You just made it worse for her," he snarled. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow, his voice steady. "Come and try." The alien roared and rushed forward. Mark met him head-on, their weapons clashing with a metallic crack. The force of the blow jarred Mark's arm, but he held on, twisting his wrench and pulling the alien off balance. Rin darted in from the side, swinging her pipe into the alien's ribs. The scarred man let out a deep grunt, staggering back a step. Mark followed with a hard swing to the alien's temple. The blow landed with a dull thud, and the scarred man collapsed to one knee. Mark didn't hesitate. He kicked the alien's weapon away and stepped in close. "You're done," he said through clenched teeth. The alien spat at his feet, but he didn't get up. The last thug, seeing his leader down and one of his men unconscious, backed away slowly. "This isn't over," he hissed. Before disappearing into the alley, Mark knew he was right. This fight might be won, but the war wasn't. He turned to Rin, who was breathing hard, gripping the pipe so tightly her knuckles were pale. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded shakily, though her eyes were still wide with adrenaline. "You fight." "For me," she said quietly, almost as if she didn't believe it herself. Mark managed a faint smile. "You're worth fighting for. They didn't waste time." Mark grabbed Rin's hand, pulling her toward the far wall. A stack of crates gave them just enough height to climb over and into the next alley. From there, they moved quickly, not stopping until the sounds of the fight were far behind them. When they finally slowed, Rin leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Mark scanned the street ahead, already thinking about their next move. "We can't keep doing this," he said. Rin nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we leave." Far away, Mark met her gaze and saw the same thing he felt: fear. Yes, but also determination. They both knew that the only real way to end this was to disappear completely. And that meant the next step would change everything. The streets. Ahead were quiet, but Mark's mind refused to relax. Every shadow felt like it could hide another pursuer. Every sound of boots on stone made his muscles tighten. Rin walked beside him, her hood pulled low, her pipe still in her grip, like she wouldn't let it go until they were truly safe. They had no home to go back to, no friends to turn to. But Mark knew there was one place in the spaceport that might give them a chance: Dock 9. It was the oldest and least monitored dock in the district, used by smugglers, wanderers, and those who wanted to leave without being seen. If they could find a captain willing to take them far away, they might finally escape this endless chase. They reached the dock just as the pale morning light began to fill the sky. A thick mist rolled in from the distant sea, curling around the ships like ghostly fingers. Most of the crews were loading cargo, their voices carrying over the sound of clanging metal. Mark spotted an old cargo freighter at the far end, its hull scratched, its name painted in fading letters. "The Wind's Way." He led Rin toward it. A tall woman in a patched leather coat stood at the bottom of the ramp, a datapad in her hand. Her sharp eyes caught them instantly, scanning them with the kind of look that weighed people's worth in seconds. "Looking for passage?" she asked, her voice rough but not unfriendly. Mark nodded. "We can work for it." The woman's gaze lingered on Rin, taking in her thin frame, the torn clothing, the way she stayed slightly behind Mark. "Where you headed?" the captain asked. Mark hesitated, then said, "As far from here as you can take us." The captain's brow lifted slightly, but she didn't ask more. Instead, she named a price high, but not impossible. Mark reached into his bag and handed over most of the credits he had saved. It wasn't enough for comfort, but it was enough for survival. The captain glanced at the payment, then jerked her head toward the ramp. "Get on board," she said. "We leave in 20 minutes, Rin." Followed Mark up the ramp, her steps slow, as if she was afraid the ground might vanish beneath her. The freighter's interior was narrow and dim, the walls humming faintly with the ship's power. The captain's voice called from behind them, "Find a spot in the crew quarters, stay out of the way." During launch, they found a small bunk room with 2 empty beds. Mark dropped the bag at the foot of one bed and sat down, his shoulders finally lowering. Rin stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around, her hands gripping the strap of her cloth bundle tightly. "You can sit," Mark said with a faint smile, slowly. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the other bed for a long while. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy, but it was strange. It felt like they were both waiting for the ship to move before they could believe they were truly leaving. When the engines finally rumbled to life, Rin's head lifted. The vibrations in the floor seemed to travel through her whole body. She turned to Mark, her eyes reflecting both fear and wonder. "We go now?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Yeah, we're going." She let out a slow breath, one hand resting on the wall as if she could feel the ship carrying her away from everything that had hunted her. Mark leaned back against the bunk, watching. You're safe now, he said quietly. Rin looked at him for a long moment before replying, safe. With you, she said softly. The freighter lifted off, the low hum of its engines growing into a deep roar. Through the small window, the city began to shrink, the maze of streets fading into a patchwork of steel and stone. Beyond it, the endless stretch of stars waited, silent and vast. Mark felt the tension in his chest begin to ease just a little. Hours passed as the ship moved farther from the planet. Mark shared a small meal with Rin, the first time they had eaten without looking over their shoulders. She still lay carefully, but now there was no desperation in her movements. When she finished, she set the plate aside and sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the stars. You know, Mark said after a while, we don't have to stop running just to hide. We can start over somewhere. Rin turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Start over, she repeated, almost testing the words. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes. New life. Mark smiled faintly. We'll figure it out. The sound of the engines became almost like a lullaby. Rin lay down on her bunk, her eyes still on the stars. Before sleep took her, she whispered, "Thank you." Mark, he didn't reply right away. He just watched her for a moment, seeing the exhaustion finally give way to rest. Then he leaned back, closing his own eyes. For the first time since he had found her eating from that bowl in the street, he let himself believe that maybe they had a chance. Far beyond the window, the stars kept moving past. The planet behind them faded into darkness. Ahead was only the unknown, but for both of them, it was better than the life they had left behind. The hunt might begin again someday, but for now, they were free.